Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the daily update. Hope you guys had a good day trading today. Market is down about 0.35% on the S&P. It was up about 0.2, 0.3 or so all throughout the day. And looks like we did see that decline on the last 2 hours. Let's try to figure out what went wrong for the bulls. It looked like we saw a gap up. We're holding above it. And the oscillators, advancing to the upside. But what had happened though, and then we did see the last 2 hours of decline here. So I think, and if you go back and check my last night's video, I think the best case scenario that I laid out for the buyers was gapping up above this gap here. So you can see we actually had this gap here, right? This was still open, and we actually focused on this gap yesterday that the buyers needed to fill that gap as quickly as possible. But when the gap gets filled, it's going to act as resistance. We talked about that. So best case scenario for the buyers were to gapping up over it and opening at around 381 or so. I think if we saw something like that, I think we could have had more smooth move to the upside. Well, we did see a gap up, and then we got up and filled that gap. And once that gap got filled, it did act as resistance, which we've been talking about this week. So the gap got filled, it was acting as resistance. And ever since then, you can see how the market started to kind of deteriorate a little bit. And we saw a little bit of bump here once the gap was filled. So you can see there's a small up gap, right? That got filled, and that's where we saw that small dip buying activities there. But keep in mind, this was a much bigger down gap, right? Because actually, back in January 11th, this is where it opened. This is where it closed, and this is where it opened. So this was actually a big gap down, right? So when this thing got up and filled it, it's gonna give that much impact for the buyers, the way it's going to act as resistance, because it was a big gap down. Though we did see pretty quickly, we saw a big green bar there, but nonetheless, this was a big gap down. This was kind of tiny gap up, right? This was a tiny gap up. So we saw the tiny dip buying activities there on the 4th hour. And 5th hour, we couldn't continue. We continued lower, and I think there was a micro term support here, right? And that level was lost. My short-term moving average was, hovering in that vicinity also. We pushed right through it, and it looks like a lot of these short-term stops were getting taken out in that vicinity there. So I think it would have been best if the buyers were able to gap it up above 381 to kind of minimize this hecticness here. But it's better though. Keep in mind, in looking at things more of a midterm, short to midterm, it's better that we're seeing a pullback after this gap got filled. It would have been much, much worse if we saw this gap open. We didn't see this, price getting up here and filling this gap, and if we were seeing this thing start coming down at this level, right? It would have been much worse. You would have to deal with the much more hecticness, more prolonged hecticness. But now that this gap is filled, right? That gap fill that's act as resistance. And again, we've been under this level at 381 pretty much about a week now after this big gap down. So now we're pulling back. There's a little bit of a strength here because we didn't see any kind of dip buying activities, because last time we saw that decline, buyers came in, brought up above the short-term moving average. This time, they were not able to bring it back up above the short-term moving average. Rather, we kind of flushed right through, and we actually closed the day below the short-term moving average. And you might be wondering, what is that purple line there? What if I zoom out? You'll see that we may have kind of a short-term pivot to kind of be aware of tomorrow if we do see any kind of bounce here. So you can see that's a resistance. that's a support, that's a support, and that's where we're at. That's a potential support. If we did see any kind of bounce tomorrow, if the buyer, and this is how quickly bulls can change this sentiment. I have to say, in the micro to short term, we're kind of the sentiment shifting back to bearish at this point. I will stay neutral to bearish as of today, but if the buyers want to change that sentiment quickly, get back above my short-term moving average, which is at 379.14 currently. So let's say, and hold this here, that support. Let's say if we gap up tomorrow at 379.39, or just make a, we move back up above it first hour, and then there's that short-term moving average there, come back, retest on the second hour, push it back up. And by the third hour, we come back to 381, this level there. I think that sentiment is going to come back to bullish very, very quickly and right above that rising pivot. If not, bears going to want to come back down, challenge this gap once again. They challenged it here, but quickly it was brought up. They're trying to go after this gap again here, 376. We might get a little bit better idea if we check out that oscillator here real quick. So I see a couple things. We actually seeing premature cross. We usually buyers, what they like to do, you can see if I kind of zoom out a little bit here, buyers, usually when they bring it up, they usually bring it all the way back up to the top of his band, all the way back up to the top of his band, all the way pretty close to, the top of his band. But ever so slightly, we're not quite getting there. There's that space here. Do you see that space? There's no space here. There's a little bit of space. It got a little more space here, and then we're getting a little bit more space here, right? This white space between the oscillator and the top of his band. That tells us that might be in the midterm, there's a little bit of a weakness here, right? We're not seeing bulls pushing up all the way back up to the top of his band confidently. So that's something to be aware of. I wouldn't too much weight on that right now. But another thing I can kind of see is we kind of have a slight bearish divergence, right? We did see that equal highs on the price. That's the equal highs, right? But on the oscillator, we got lower high. It would have been so much more potent bearish divergence if the price cultivated higher high while the oscillator cultivated lower high. In this case, price cultivated equal highs while the oscillator cultivated lower high here. So that also adds onto that bit more bearishness, a little bit heavier look here. So I think going into tomorrow, I think we'll have a better picture in the first 2 hours. Again, bulls want to gap back above my short-term moving average, right? Currently residing around 379. So we want to get back above 379 the first 2 hours tomorrow and hold above that short-term moving average. Then we can say that this rising pivot is holding. Bears, you got to keep pushing lower if you want to challenge this gap here. And ultimately what bears want to do is fill this gap, right? Because that's where a lot of the bullishness been coming from. Right, I come back for you. Enjoy your evening and good luck trading tomorrow.